Thank you for being here. And the meeting that I was just at before, it had a very slow start because we were wondering where everybody was, and they were all in the parking lot listening to the radio as the testimony unfolds. So thank you for being here. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So, well, welcome. And this region is definitely special to me, not only because I live here, but it really was the inspiration behind me ending up at the center in a very unconventional way, because for 20 years I was an investment banker, completely different career, and I covered media companies and information services companies and worked at firms on Wall Street. And I was always very passionate about public education. The first place I got that passion was from in your neighborhood, Spring Valley High School and East Ramapo Central School District, where I grew up. Had a great experience there, and still remember it fondly, and still keep in touch with some of my teachers, and it was a really special place to me. And then when we moved to Westchester in 2010, and my kids went to Byram Hills, I have 3 kids that are all in school there now, I was the chairman of the Education Foundation that tries to raise money charitably for the school to supplement the budgets that we all know are these days very tough to come by. And in doing that work, started to be very, very involved in some of the Race to the Top initiatives in 2012-13 that impacted all of our districts in very meaningful ways. And I got very interested in what was going wrong there and some of the issues that New York was facing in public education, and ended up using that really as an impetus to switch directions. And I went up and did a fellowship for a year on the rollout of Race to the Top in New York State up at Harvard. And it was a great year. I have to say, though, with Marc having published 100 papers, I've published 1. It was a damn good one, but only 1. But that's okay, because we have a center full of incredibly talented professors and folks with education backgrounds and psychology backgrounds. I have a really different background, but trying to work with the center to scale our work, to get it into more schools, and then ultimately to try to also think about the work from a leadership perspective. And that's why you're all here, and that's what I want to talk a little bit about before Marc gets even deeper into the tools and some of the work that we do in schools. With that, I want to first talk about why we're all here, which is really students. And as Renee started to go through some of the statistics, it is a bit of a scary world out there. We did a study at our center not that long ago looking at American high school students and their emotions, and what are the 3 that are the most prevalent? Tired, bored, stressed. Not particularly surprising. We all feel it, I think, in this region in different ways across all of our schools, and it's something clearly that I think a lot of folks in Putnam, Westchester, Rockland have taken very seriously and are trying to figure out ways to address some of the issues that we see. And these issues crop up on college campuses. You had some statistics. We can say certainly when you look at some of the Ivy League schools, you have over 50% of the student population visiting mental health services during their time on those campuses. And recently, we looked at across the state of Connecticut, lots of different colleges, so not just Yale, but broadly a set of colleges, and there was a reported 20% a year increase in visits to mental health services. And at the end of the day, what we're really trying to do is get to students when they're younger, as they're going through the pre-K to 12 system, to try to give them the tools to be able to understand their emotions, to self-regulate, to learn how to build constructive relationships. And so we can try to avoid some of the pitfalls that they face as they navigate through life and face some of these challenges as they get into middle school, high school, and then ultimately college, or wherever they choose to go after we all hope that they all graduate. So that's the objective of our work and the heart of our work. But at the end of the day, Marc, many years ago, before I met him, was going around probably with his rolling suitcase, school to school, going classroom to classroom, doing this great work, and it was doing a lot of good in a lot of these classes. But he soon came to realize that it was much more powerful and much more impactful if you think about the school holistically, and therefore our training kind of morphed into training where the school leader was involved along with faculty and staff. And that way, it was much more systemic and much more meaningful, and it had much more of a chance of working. Then fast forward, after that happened for a while, there was a realization that a school is one part of a district, but a district is much broader and much more complicated, and why not look at it from a systemic perspective district-wide? And so that's really the impetus of this night tonight, and a lot of the work that we do, including a lot of the work we do at Yale and some institutes that we host, and work that we do around the country and around the world, for that matter, with school leaders. And the great thing about our work is, at the end of the day, the tools that we teach for classrooms ultimately can be applied to organizations. And I think when coming from the world of business into the world of school governance from a standpoint of Byram Hills, and then doing our work at the center, there's a difference between a corporate board and a school board, and I think it makes life very challenging on the school board side for a few specific reasons. One of which is open meeting laws, because if you think about the way a corporation often works, especially a private one, but even a public one, there's a lot of work done behind the scenes. And if there's conflict, if there are issues, eventually they may come out in board minutes or in an annual meeting, but a lot of work can be done behind the scenes to really fix things, whereas we're obligated by school law to make sure that our meetings are videotaped, open to the public, and so a lot of the issues that we have to deal with end up being very public. Second thing is the negativity around public education. I mean, clearly we have it in the country, in this region, but if we think about all of our issues around whether it's APPR or the SALT tax most recently, which we're trying to fight, or all the issues around the tax cap and what that does to budgeting processes and making it more complicated for us to make the decisions we need to make as school board members, there's a lot of negativity sort of around the system. And then, lastly, it's about kids. And as we know, that parents get emotional about their kids. I get emotional about my kids, and so we have to navigate through all that in order to do our job from a leadership and governance standpoint. So for all those reasons, and with that backdrop, if you think about our work and how it relates to the job of a school board member or the job of a school leader, there are a couple things to think about, and Marc's going to go into much more detail on some of this, but just to try to link it to what we do. The first is thinking about teachers, and another survey that our center did relatively recently. We did a national survey of 6,000 teachers, so it was a fairly large sample size, and we measured their feelings towards their work. And 70% of the emotions that teachers used to describe their lives were negative, 70%, which is pretty startling. And the three most prevalent emotions were being frustrated, overwhelmed, and stressed, which is not that dissimilar to what the high school survey ended up telling us. And when we really take a step back and think about that, and think about the way that we manage our organizations and manage schools in this country at the end of the day, do we really have a handle on teacher engagement and teacher wellness and teacher emotional state? And if there really is that much negativity as teachers look at their job day to day, how will that implicate things in the classroom, and how can we expect students to be as engaged as we want them to be when we have teachers that may not feel part of the system in which they work? And so we've done a lot of thinking about that at the center, and we'll talk more about that tonight. We are also in the process of developing surveys that schools can use for themselves to measure the level of engagement of their teacher force, and therefore be able to just make better decisions about what's working, what's not. It's in development right now, and we're fairly close to being able to offer it to rural schools, so that'll come down the road, and obviously it's optional, but we think it could be a really useful tool. And a lot of work has been done on that in other industries. Certainly a lot of corporations do it, and there are many hospitals that do a lot of survey work. But it's a little bit newer to the world of education, and we think it's a really important piece of the puzzle, not the only piece, but a really important piece of the puzzle. The second thing is to think about the superintendent and school board role as it relates to our work. And if you think about the fact that a lot of our work is about building relationships, and we think about kids building relationships in a healthy way as they grow up, the most delicate and important potentially relationship in a system is that between a superintendent and a school board. And it's one that is complicated to manage sometimes. There are a lot of school boards that I know, as any school board member does, they sometimes have a tendency to want to micromanage, and sometimes the superintendent may be comfortable or not comfortable giving feedback. Same thing with the board giving feedback to the superintendent. And thinking about the power of that relationship, and if you get it right, what it can do for an overall system, I think is really important and meaningful. Second thing is emotion and decision making, which is something we spend a lot of time with at the center. So if you think about all of us that come to school board work, for those of us that are school board members, but even if you're an administrator at a senior level making big decisions, we all have different places that we've come from, whether it's through our kids or ourselves. And I mean, I probably came at the work thinking like very academically, oh, we need more AP courses, oh, we need more homework, and then I may have somebody sitting next to me that has a very different opinion. And to really try to disconnect from our sort of quick judgment about certain things and to think more deliberately is an important skill that you have to have in leadership, and it's one of the skills that certainly we talk about when we do our work in schools, whether again it's in the classroom or ultimately in a faculty room or in a boardroom. And then if you, think about other ways in which our work really corresponds to work as a school board member, just the context of school board meetings happening at 9 o'clock at night after a day of work when you have to get up early the next morning and you're tired and you're listening to an issue that's complicated and or contentious and you're thinking, wait, why am I here? Why did I do this? I'm not getting paid. What about my kids at home, or what about work the next day? And we all have obviously those moments where it is overwhelming, and yet those are the moments where we have to make some of the most important decisions. And so again, thinking about that lens of decision making and the connection to emotions can be really powerful to try to focus on, so that we all, including me, can come better at doing the work that we do. So there are a lot of ways in which the work connects, and so when we think about our work, we really do think about it through the whole system. And so that gives you a little bit of an overview of just how we think about from the classroom to the faculty and staff up through the administration and the board level, and how ultimately if we can make schools more emotionally intelligent overall, it can lead to great things for everyone involved. That's really the objective that we have at the center. And I'll stop there for a second just to see if there are any initial questions, but we have a lot more to walk through in terms of content to get into the more specific tools and approaches that we have as we think about this work.
One other thing that just came to mind for me in terms of the school board is the allocation of resources for the work.
Yes, of course.
Right.
Yep.
That sometimes superintendents want to do something new, and then they have to fight for the resources and the challenge for that.
That's right. And of course, it's as we all know, monetary resources is a part of it, but it's also how we're monitoring and managing and thinking about the growth of the district, and this being a component, whether it's in the district goals or ultimately whether it's something that you measure over time, whether it's through statistics or ultimately through anecdotes, but looking at a more holistic view of how a school's operating, the wellness of children and social emotional learning generally could be powerful.
Yeah. When you were giving the example about a classic school board person who's there at night, has to get up early, et cetera, and emotions, I'm a little confused. Were you saying that we should separate ourselves from emotions to make the decisions, or we should be more in touch with our emotions to make these decisions?
No, that's a great question, and I'll start, and then you're going to continue. So,
Depends on the decision and the emotion.
Well, my ex-wife is going to be more in touch, but that's.
Well, right. It's having that awareness. That's really what it is. Having the awareness of the fact that maybe you are not in a particularly good. It's not disconnecting necessarily, because that's, I think, not a particularly practical thing to do, but it's having the awareness. It's just taking a step back at that moment to say, oh, wait a minute, I am frustrated, I am tired, I may be coming at this in a way that I'm rushing to judgment, or I'm not thinking about it holistically. Let me take a step back, let me take a moment, let me think about it. That's really what we talk about. Anything you add on that, Mr. Professor?
Just that, our emotions have an influence our decisions whether we're conscious of it or not, right? Because they're always at play. So if they're, if you're, sometimes we call it like incidental effects. So you've had a fight with your kid, or you're irritated at something that went on earlier, you come to the meeting, you don't realize that you're still brewing over the irritation, and then you're asked to make a decision about X, Y, or Z, and you're like, I don't like that idea. But it has nothing to do with the idea, it has to do with the emotion that you had from a previous experience. And until we build that self-awareness around like, all right, wait a minute, am I not in favor of that, or am I just pissed off at what happened earlier? We tend to make poor choices.
I think having my two hats, and I've been a school social worker for 15 years before that I was social worker in other venues. Last year, I guess there was no longer a school social worker, I was a therapist for 5 or 6 kids dealing with things that were dealt with in the hospitals, but they had to come out of the hospital eventually, and they continued in our school. And today we get another word of a 26-year-old who committed suicide in the high school district. It's about the 8th or 9th 25 to 30-year-old that I know. I should not know 25 to 30 years old. So we need to become more comfortable than uncomfortable, and with difficult, and with being in touch with being uncomfortable. And, we hear initiative after initiative, let's do PBIS, and let's do this, and let's do that, and we need to kind of stop, think and put something in place that is truly systemic.
That's right, and the goal of our work is really to weave it in very naturally to a lot of different places. And so it could be weaved into an English class or a history class or a homeroom class or guidance, but there are a lot of different ways, and there's no exact formula that you necessarily need to follow because every school is different and every school has different scheduling issues or different ways in which they want to roll something like this out. But it's really an approach and not a stocked canned program. It's an approach that you can wrap around your curriculum in a more natural way.
So before I jump on, Scott gave you some provocative ideas to think about. If you were to, we have about 45 minutes. What do you want to leave here knowing or thinking? What do you want to, what would be your ultimate outcome? I'll leave here knowing X. What comes to mind? Just go around and what would you like to know? Please.
Since this is new to me, I guess, what tools do you use to evaluate social emotional instability for kids and teachers? Just like, we have a lot of trauma in our school, so that post-secondary stress that our teachers deal with.
Yeah.
And then what are some of the approaches that you've used and been successful?
Okay, so the approach that we're using to implement, and then how are we evaluating or assessing? Wonderful. Anything else come to mind for you?
Well, first of all, I'd like to know exactly what you mean by social emotional.
Yep. So what is SEL?
In regards to K-12. And also, since I'm here as a board member, I would really like to know what you would consider the role of a board member in implementing social emotional.
Right. That's why Scott now works at the center. Great, thank you. Other thoughts that come to mind?
I think mental health is the biggest problem that our kids face. I don't know if we do enough, and I don't think the services are out there. They used to be in our county. So very easily not mandated, they get cut.
So just the principles about mental health and what's going on there.
Yeah, where do they go?
Yeah.
Who do they talk to?
Well, I think part of what I want to argue for is let's prevent it from happening, right? So we spend a lot of money and we have a lot of resources, and not enough still, but intervention approaches. Like when I was doing work in the New York City schools, there was life-based crisis intervention, therapeutic crisis intervention, all these crises interventions, and I was like, well, what are we, what's going on in the classrooms to teach the kids the skills they need to prevent the crises? So they had all these paraprofessionals running and pulling these kids who were getting aggressive into these rooms to calm them down. But then I would ask the kids, so how are you feeling? And they would have no words to describe their feelings and say, well, what strategies do you know how to manage? They didn't even know what I was talking about. So I think we have to, one thing I'll mention is this idea of the prevention approach as opposed to, the intervene when all of a sudden, schools spend an enormous amount of money after tragedies. I'm blown away in Connecticut, where I live, how much money after we have a horrific tragedy, whether it be a shooting or whether it be a suicide, how much money gets invested into schools to put bulletproof glass, windows, to, all the counselors and all these that come into the school district. And then I say, well, Ruler, as many of you know, because you have this in your schools, we charge $6,000 for a school, or $7,000 depending, and you get full training, you get supports for every teacher. And when you compare that to what schools are spending, in legal fees for a bullying incident, you start realizing, wow, this is a much more cost-effective approach. But yet our mindsets are very much, let's wait till something bad happens and then we do something about it, as opposed to let's get in there and make something a permanent part of the way we educate kids.
It seems to be the mentality, though, too, of health insurance and everything.
It is.
They'll pay for things once you have the illness, but there's not a lot of money for prevention.
Right, nobody's.
I think it's a whole. I think it's not.
Things are moving. I was just at a big conference on mental health,
I wondered if that's
and insurance companies are now paying for yoga. They're paying for massage. They're recognizing
paying for therapists
yes.
or whatever to get there.
But I think this component of prevention versus intervention is an important one.
Are you giving us an overview of kind of how it's being woven
Yes.
into into
Yep.
schools? That's
So that'll be the tools and approach piece.
They don't take this yet.
I'll wait to talk about impulse control until the end of the.
delay of gratification of eating. What comes up at this table group over here that we haven't mentioned yet? Anything else that you want to know about or hear about that's not yet on the table?
We participate in your training, so we know everything.
That's a great answer.
You know, I have to drive an hour and a half home, so if you'd like to come up. But in terms of what you'd want other people here to know in your district? Since you went to the training, is there a nugget from the training that you feel like, oh my goodness?
I think, coming from a special ed point of view, I spend a lot of time working with the teachers and clinicians, working and talking and trying to brainstorm ways to support students in their mental health. And it really gets in the way of students being able to participate. And we spend a lot of time wondering what type of programs we can send them to, or what kind of programs or what type of trainings can we have our clinicians do? Should they be doing DBT, or should they be doing mindfulness? So I guess what I'm looking for is a way to tie all of those pieces, all those good things we're doing, but tie it all together and make it systemic.
Yeah, wonderful. So kind of the systemic nature and kind of putting all, because you get, like someone said, PBIS, and then there's mindfulness, and then there's therapeutic things. There's millions of different kind of piecemeal-y things that we throw at schools, yet how do they weave them into one thing or get rid of the stuff that's kind of ancillary and just focus on something that really can work systemically?
I think one of the most powerful things I heard you say a couple of sessions ago was that the first year is really about working with your staff.
Yeah.
Everyone from your teachers to those who work in the kitchen to your secretaries to just the importance of it being
the adult modeling for the kids.
The adult modeling for the kids, because the statistics you mentioned are astounding. 70% of our teachers are reporting really being miserable in the profession. And we know from
well, you know that 50% leave the profession after 5 years, with before 5 years is up.
From a board's perspective, I mean, we're always talking about the cost of that hiring process. Mm-hmm. And the turnover, we know what it does to kids in classrooms. But also the fact that, we have two of our principals here, and we know the research shows that besides teachers, it's your building leaders that have the most impact in a classroom when it comes to student achievement.
Right.
So, these are the guys that have to work with those teachers that are reporting, 70% of them are reporting being miserable. So, for us, it was really about, I'm not by any means saying we have a miserable school, but, for us, it's about keeping people motivated and making sure that, because many years ago, when I first started in the profession, you're told leave your emotions at the door. That's how we work with kids, leave them at the door. No matter what happened the night before,
right.
No matter what happened the morning of, you leave them at the door and you go on with your lesson. And, I often wonder, are we not modeling the right way for kids? Mm-hmm.
Well, we know it's also not possible, right? So it's like leave your amygdala at home. Do you know what I mean? Like your brain goes, right? It's like, like your brain goes with you wherever you go, as do your feelings, as does your intellect, as does everything. It's like you can't separate.
For us, this was really enticing because we want our teachers to be motivated, and all the things you mentioned before, APPR, I think, caused so much. I call it APPR PTSD, really, because it caused so much chaos and stress and anxiety for not only our teachers but our principals. So now you've taken, as I said, two groups of people that are most impactful on student achievement and made them really stressed out and anxious.
Yeah.
So, how do we reverse that? And we chose to focus on our middle school because it's developmentally, it's a really tough time for kids. So
you're only working in middle school right now, not elementary.
5-8 right now, and then the hope is to roll it out K4. Our elementary principals are chomping at the bit. So
good, that's what you want.
So that's just to kind of capitalize on what Judy was saying. That was really for us. I think the hope was to start with the teachers and model it and bring it to the kids.
Yeah, great. What about for the two of you, or the three of you?
Well, since I got off, I was on the board 25 years ago. I got off in order to go back to teaching. I'm back on the board. But in the 25 years that I was off the board, I went to almost every board meeting. In fact, when I joined the board this time, they're like, well, we've lost our audience, because I was the only one sitting in the audience. So I've been listening about Ruler, but didn't really wasn't part of the training. I really wanted to understand it. But to me, the most impactful thing is sort of like when we retrained our staff, that all of us teach English language arts. Gym teachers, custodians, like all of us teach language arts. All of us have to understand our own emotions and be able to help students. Like it can't be this child is from, sending him to the principal or sending him to the social worker or sending him whatever. You know,
Great
but it's dealing with it in all of the aspects of their life, not that it's a separate thing that you have to go somewhere else in order to fix.
Sure.
Great point. And that's part of, I think, the challenge that, like, one of the things that's still problematic that all of you can get on our bus to help us fix is that no matter what, because there's not a line in the school budget for social and emotional learning in general, right? There's a line for history, for science, for math, for language arts, but SEL is this thing that we adopt and we kind of squeeze it in, and then is how do we make it feel like it's more prominent? And you know, who is the person who reports to the superintendent on like how are we doing socially and emotionally with our teachers and with our students? I think when that happens, we're going to see a lot more sustainability in the work, because then you're going to have people who are accountable, I hate to use that word, but for the implementation of this work. And right now, you go for training, you implement, but there's no real monitoring, and there's nobody like really responsible at the district level. And what we're finding is that in our bigger districts where they hire someone like a deputy superintendent or assistant superintendent who's in charge of ruler or SEL, it really makes a big difference. Now I know smaller districts probably don't have the budget for that, but nevertheless, who can it fall under? Like the PPS director, instruction. You know, you boost it under instruction, and then it all of a sudden elevates its importance.
It rolls downhill. We're not taking the hit.
So let me just ask this man, and then we'll come back.
Jeffrey, I don't know. I came here. We have. I know you're going to be in Chappaqua on November 6th, if I'm not mistaken. And I'm the only one who can come tonight.
They're waiting for that.
Other obligations. So I guess, and I've listened to what you said so far. I knew very little about what you hear, your work. I guess if you wanted to bottom line it, I'm here to see if I think, I'd like to learn if I think you're worth the money that we're going to spend on it. I guess is the bottom line. But you said some things that were interesting to me, and it sort of related to my question before, because I've spent my career training myself to not have emotions. I'm a derivatives trader. To look at the numbers and not say to myself, whatever.
Would you like to invest in our center? I don't care about your feelings about the center.
I mean, as I said before, I have an ex-wife, so there's issues here. But maybe I did it too well, But I mean, it's interesting because the woman over there before said, leave it at the door. Well, I literally had to train myself to leave it at the door, to turn on a switch, and then come home. And whether it's learning not to curse in front of my kids or just being more emotional with my family, it's an interesting thing. So I'm here just to find out what you're all about.
Yeah, great. Well, and by the way, like what you're saying is critically important, because it's not, I think part of it is this conception that having emotions means being emotional, right? And being being calm and serene and tranquil while doing some problem solving is fabulous, right? But we think of emotions as being like, I'm histrionic, or I'm, pissed, or we always talk about the extremes as opposed to just kind of everyday, life feelings. So, please.
Just because the board is here, and I feel like what would be helpful when we're talking to staff is for them to know the support that we have from the board, just by taking the time tonight and knowing that this is a priority and it does matter to you, it matters to us, and for the teachers to just know this really is on top of our pile of things to do, and not just one more thing to do. So I think that that's a struggle I want to not have, and so knowing that it's got the support of the board and central administration is going to be very helpful.
Can I just add one thing also?
Yeah, please.
For years, I joined the board because there was concerns with achievement of our students. But then, on the other hand, I was school social workers who are more about the feelings. But it is not an accident that the socially intelligent, comfortable in their skin, able to problem solve, get along with everybody teachers are the ones that have the best results.
Yeah.
Right.
And we've said all along, kids learn if they think the teacher likes them. But I think even if the teacher doesn't like them, if the teacher knows how to problem solve and handle things, and those are the better teachers. And it's no longer an accident. We have to marry those two. Achievements come when you're socially and emotionally intelligent.
Yep, thank you for that. So I want to do one thing, which is start off with this slide, because I know the focus, and I know because we're all concerned around mental health. Right, anxiety, depression, we know is problematic in our nation right now. But it's one piece of the reason why we do this work, right? Some schools have fewer mental health problems, and it doesn't mean they shouldn't be doing this work. Because when you think about the role of emotions and emotion skills, what we know from many years of research is that there's 5 kind of buckets that we care a lot about. The first is just attentional capacity. So forget about mental health. If you're in a classroom that's really freaking boring, you're not doing well academically. Right? Put your mental health aside. If the instruction is not engaging, you are bored. Boredom is a feeling, and it also drives you to do things like doodle and think about everything else in your life that matters more than the classroom that you're in. So there's a big piece there that I think we have to focus on, is that teachers being cognizant of the role of emotions in learning is super powerful, because then all of a sudden you're thinking about, wow, how is my student feeling during that social studies lesson? How are they feeling in math? How are they feeling in science? And what do I need to bring them to a place where they're emotionally engaged? What's my strategy for not only delivering the expert content, but also making it emotionally attractive and engaging to kids? The second is decision making, and I think Scott and we spoke about this briefly, but just to reiterate, what we know from many, many studies is that how we feel drives much of our judgments. So the example I would give is a study that I worked on, which was on teachers' grading policies and evaluation of students. And what we found pretty clearly was that teachers' mood influenced the way they evaluated students' work. That if they were in a bad mood, they were harsher, they gave more critical feedback, maybe not as necessary feedback. When they were in the most positive moods, it was like, it's fabulous. They didn't look for the details, they weren't paying attention to the nuances. So what that tells us is that different emotions and feelings guide the way our brain processes information. What do I mean by that? Well, when you are doing something that requires what we might call inductive reasoning, right? You're trying to be expansive in your thinking. You want to generate ideas. I don't know about you, but when I'm feeling down in the dumps, like I'm not very good at that. Right? It's when I'm feeling happy and excited that I'm like, let's do this. Oh my, Scott, let's go. Let's try this. Let's try this. Let's try this. Let's open a center in Israel. Which activates his feelings, and then, or Japan, or wherever we've been invited. We've been invited to do a lot of work, and we have to make decisions around that. You know, when you have a good day, and someone sends you an email saying, "Would you like? We would like to give you $5 million to open up a center in China." You're like, "Let's go," right? And then you're like, "Wait a minute. Let's think about that. Like, we don't even have the resources to do the work here, so now we're gonna like go somewhere else and like figure it out." But you don't. Just get a phone call with Renee or Joan and you'll be back. So, right, the positive emotions help us to be expansive in our thinking, but there often is utility for unpleasant feelings. And people say, well, why would you want to be sad or down or disappointed or angry? Well, think about it. When you are feeling slightly sad, you're a little bit more pessimistic. Sometimes you want to be pessimistic about things. Like when you're scrutinizing the budget, if you're in a great mood, you're just going to be like, whatever you want, right? And that, so there's, right, so the superintendent, right, the superintendent wants to bring in the positive emotions, right, but the school board wants, anyhow. So that's the decision-making piece, and all emotions have different function for different types of decision-making. By way of example, I'll give you a kind of out-of-the-box example. So a colleague of mine did a research study with architects. Like, well, why would emotions be relevant for architects? Well, think about it. Let's say you're designing a home for the elderly. What emotion might be most relevant for designing a home for the elderly? Well, you want to create a very compassionate, warm space. You want it to be more empathic, like in terms of its structure. You know, you might think differently if you're designing a high school than you would for a home for the elderly. So bringing people into a slightly kind of unpleasant, kind of imagining what it's like to be someone who's elderly, who has to get around in different spaces, will actually help people design a space that's more relevant or appropriate for that group. So there is interesting research to show that these emotions matter for different purposes. The third is relationship. Let me ask, have you ever had a difficult emotion at a school board meeting? Have you ever watched someone make a facial expression that kind of let you know they were not really in the best place? I'm sure, right? Like, you got to be figuring. Maybe you've seen even something like this. Just hear me out on this. Have you ever maybe witnessed someone do this kind of facial expression in a meeting? Someone has a great idea and you're watching other people and it's like, and it's not so obvious like I'm doing it, right? People don't go like, right? They do things like, right, it's a slight eye roll or maybe a look of like contempt or disgust. Like, now, why do facial expressions matter? Like, why do we care about, why would it be important for us as a species to read people?
It changes your reaction to them.
Say it again, please.
It changes your reaction to them.
Yeah. So if you say something, I'm like, wow, tell me more. Versus you give an idea and I'm like, it's like, see what you're doing right there is exactly what happens. Because emotions send signals. And you did the avoid response, right? So an angry, disgust face is saying, this person, I'm going to stay away. A gentle smile says approach. Think about this in your classrooms. I mean, just think about how teachers' nonverbal displays are influencing whether or not students feel safe and welcome in those environments, or how teachers respond to certain kids' facial expressions. That's what I mean by relationship quality, that emotions drive the quality of our relationships. They tell us to approach or avoid, to distance ourselves or to affiliate. The fourth is physical and mental health. I think we've kind of spent a lot of time thinking about that. What I will tell you is that as my day job is teaching college students who come from many of your districts, who tell me, like, now you're telling me I have to write emotion regulation on my to-do list? That's what I get. And they say things like, Professor Brackett, I didn't need these skills to get into Yale. And I say, maybe you didn't, but you're going to need them to get out, especially of my class. And I say, maybe you should have learned some social competence too. But my point is that kids have grown up with a mindset around academic performance is the key to success. Yes. What they don't realize is that that only matters for their SAT scores and their grade point averages to get in. Right. Things are going to change in that space too. Nevertheless, if our goal as high school teachers or superintendents or school boards is to get our 17-year-old, 18-year-olds into great colleges, and that's our end goal, keep doing what you're doing, right? You'll have kids who push themselves academically, who are doing drugs and drinking extra Red Bulls and not taking care of themselves, and they will, in the short run, achieve academically. It's like what the charter school network has shown, right? You can push these kids, you're a scholar, and you can drill them, and then they fall apart once they're at a university where they have to live with a roommate, where they have to make their own decisions. They don't have someone feeding them in their morning breakfast or poached eggs with their steamed spinach, right? I mean, think about it. It's a different world when you're living on a university campus than when you are at home going to high school. So again, if our end goal is, boom, let's get them into a good college, that's great. My hope is that our goal as educators is to help kids have a good life and have the skills they need to find a relationship that they can, with someone they can live with and love, have a job that they can hold and have good friendships, have the ability to manage disappointment and frustration in life. So that's the last piece, which is around performance and creativity, that we have to have a broader kind of concept of it. And right now, most people adopt social and emotional learning in the service of academics. As a matter of fact, the field had to change its name to meet the challenges with the way we think about education. What I mean by that is originally we were called social and emotional learning. Now the big report that's coming out from the National Commission that I'm part of is called SEED. Social, emotional, and academic development are inextricably linked. So we've got to make sure we put the academic in there so that people who are afraid of emotion see it inextricably linked with academics. It's kind of interesting that we're in a place where we just have to make sure that we see those social, emotional, and academic together. They are together, but they're also independent concepts. And I think I really like what you said about English language arts. Like, it's everyone's responsibility to speak proper English, right? It just is. Reading is a universal skill that helps you in social studies, it helps you in math, it helps you in science. Emotion management and emotion skills are universal skills, right? Because what we showed in our research is that if you're a principal who is emotionally dysregulated, you have a faculty that doesn't want to be at work. So remember what Scott said earlier, that the teachers are frustrated, overwhelmed, and stressed. Well, if we look at those data disaggregated, what I mean by that is break them apart by principals who are high versus low in emotional intelligence, you see a little bit of a different Wordle. So this is just one factor. These are what the teachers tell us they feel working in their schools. If they work for a teacher who is lower in emotional intelligence, you can see frustrated is much larger. You can't even see happy or excited. And then you go to a school where the principal is higher in emotional intelligence, and all of a sudden you see teachers are happier, more excited, less frustrated. Of course, like, think about this. One variable, like a principal's skills, is not going to completely change your emotional life. But nevertheless, that one factor does significantly change the emotions that teachers are having. It also, interestingly enough, has nothing to do with workload. So teachers don't feel like I have to work harder for a teacher. As a matter of fact, they work a little bit less hard when they're in a school with a principal with low emotional intelligence. But if you look at their emotional exhaustion levels, you get about a 1.5 difference. If you look at their intentions to lead the profession, you get another 1.5 difference. And if you look at their job satisfaction, you get the reverse finding.
But in the first slide that you showed, in the Wordle,
yep.
Like, to me, it's so clear that I have all of those emotions.
Yes.
I mean, it's not that any of those emotions are gone. They're just, some of them are...
The balance is better.
Play a larger part.
Yes. The balance is more appropriate for your general health and well-being. Like, life is replete. I'm frustrated every day of my life. Look who I work with. I used to be like the professor who'd think, we're going to wherever, and now I've got this executive judge who's like, I don't understand this. Like, we don't do it that way on Wall Street. And
if you want to do that derivatives trade, I'm glad you have me.
So, but the point is, well, what you're saying is well taken, which is this idea that we're going to feel all emotions in life. You lose a loved one, I hope you'll feel sad, right? You don't achieve a goal, I hope you'll be disappointed and frustrated. But on a daily basis, as an educator or a student in our schools, we shouldn't be feeling 70% of the time unpleasant frustration, overwhelm. It's not good for your body. It's not good for your creativity. It's not good for anything.
What does high EI look like?
Well, good question.
He paid me for
It can be taught.
Teachers
You know, that's the principle you're doing, but you claim it can be taught.
Correct. Otherwise, I have no career. I mean, I could fake it for a couple of years, but you get caught eventually. So I think that's a great question. How many of you, by the way, after this first, 45 minutes or so, kind of, you're on the bus. You get that how people feel matters. Yes? All right, so you asked the question, well, what does high EI look like? Well, what do you think it looks like?
Probably somebody who's likes what they're doing.
Okay.
Probably loves the children in their classroom
Yeah.
as a teacher, or if they're a principal, loves the work that they do with their staff or whatever, and you know it, just know it.
Okay. So what I hear you saying, you're talking about the outcomes.
Right.
What I'm asking you right now is, what are the underlying skills? Like when you visualize someone who you believe, and maybe you, I don't know if you can look at anybody who you're with. That was a joke, by the way. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. You know, think of the most emotionally wise person that you might know. Like someone who just has, like, you just like, that is the personification of emotional intelligence. What skills do you believe they have? You can think about it for a moment.
I'm going to think about it.
So I'm thinking about, in our classes at BOCES, the teachers who can work best with kids who have really, you know, their behaviors are always on the edge. And there are teachers who internalize those behaviors rather than saying, this child is having this behavior and he's doing the best he can, like the DBT, and I can stay above it. And then there are teachers who internalize it and react to the kids rather than realizing they're there for a reason, that's why you're here, and you can't take it personally.
Right.
So it's being able to understand your environment and say, I understand this environment and I can do this.
Yep, and that environment includes your inner environment of how you feel.
Right.
So this child is making me feel angry based on their behavior, but I don't have to like absorb that anger. I can understand that that's anger and I can identify it, but I also have the strategies to manage it for myself. Yes? Were you going to say something?
No, I was just thinking of categorizing someone who has positive, or I like positive is the word, good emotional intelligence.
Uh-huh.
I'm thinking someone's positive or introspective, you know, like someone who's kind of just very aware of their emotions, and you know, I feel like
yeah, so self-aware.
I don't know if that's even the right word, really, just someone, yeah, I think
yep.
really, and always evaluates.
So introspective. There are certain people who are like, it's either a good day or a bad day. And there are some people say, I'm disappointed. No, it's not quite. I'm a little bit angry. No, it's not angry. I'm actually livid right now. No, you know what? I realize it's frustration, not anger. Right? That's that granularity in self-awareness, that introspection, that questioning. Did you want? Yes, please, in the back.
I'm just thinking someone who, when you have a conversation with them, is actually making eye contact and reading how you feel before reacting.
So the nonverbal communication.
And also interjecting the same, expressing themselves as well, so that the other party can understand them, rather than just speaking at them. And then finally, analyzing before speaking back, thinking, taking one step back before reacting.
So you're getting at this idea of emotion perception, like being aware of nonverbal cues, like this person is interested, not interested, I should probably shift the conversation because they're getting bored or they're getting pissed or whatever might be happening, and having the strategies to manage. Yeah?
I'm just going to say flexibility, I think, is a skill set. The ability to come in with a plan, see the plan's not going to work, and quickly shift on the dime and reload another plan.
Nice. So this idea of kind of being self-aware, you know, I'm disappointed, but it's not over, right? I'm apologizing to Scott for being mean. He's saying, you know, I'm glad you're apologizing, Mark, but I'm still really upset. And I'm like, well, go blank yourself. Or I say, you know what? Let me think of another way to approach this. Let me try this. Let me try this. Let me really explain. So it's kind of like understanding how to navigate that space. Well, you guys got it. So we call those skills the ruler skills. Ba-da-bum, right? So ruler is the name of our approach. It's also the same name for the 5 skills of emotional intelligence, and there are 5. So when we define an emotionally intelligent person, we define that person as having 5 discrete skills. The first is they're very perceptive of the environment as well as their own emotions. So I'm aware of how the group feels. I'm aware of, well, I just walked into an environment and I'm feeling uncomfortable. There's something going on here that's making me not feel right. Understanding of emotion has to do with knowing why. What's the cause of it? Like, what happened that made this child feel this way? So oftentimes we talk about 2 emotions, like jealousy and envy. Has anybody ever experienced either of those? What's the difference? Is there a difference?
Slight difference.
Say more.
The intensity of it. You know, I think jealousy, I think, is more negative than envy, because envy is just a natural, I think, human reaction that, you know, that we like to have what you have, but jealousy, I think, is a little more mean-spirited.
Okay. What do we think? Do we like her definition, or do you want to add to it?
I would even say mean-spirited or resentful. Like with jealousy, you're resentful that someone has what you want. Envy is you want it too. Have it as much as you want. I want it too.
Any other definitions to throw out? All right, how confident are we? If we let, it's a wrap. We're out of here. What do you think? Now, you guys went through the training? Remember you asked about assessment? This is the summative assessment here. So, jealousy is a relationship-driven emotion. I'm jealous in relationships. So, if you and I were a couple and I saw you looking at someone else and flirting with them, I would be jealous of that person because I feel threatened that I'm going to lose you to that person. Jealousy is a relationship emotion. It's oftentimes about triangle in classrooms. It's not always about romantic relationships. It's about, wow, that kid really gets a lot of attention from the teacher. Right? I'm starting to resent that teacher. I'm starting to feel threatened by that kid because that kid is getting a lot more attention than I'm getting. Why am I? What about me? What about me? What about me? Siblings, right? A lot of jealousy. Like, who pays more attention to this boy? Mom, dad. My favorite story about this, we have a school in California we work with, and this one male kindergarten teacher. He was not on the bus to do this work at first, but his kids were in a rural school, and they were having this big argument at breakfast. And the father said, I'm sick of all this anger. And his 7-year-old son said, Dad, it's jealousy. Right? And it was jealousy because the boy, who was the younger one, was angry or upset that the 7-year-old had more mommy time than he had. And the 7-year-old realized that, no, Daddy, he's jealous that I have more mommy time than he has. So why does that matter? Why would we want to articulate or label it properly? So you can deal with it. Exactly. Like if I'm angry because of unfairness or disappointed because of some expectation that was not met, how you would regulate would be very different. So that's the labeling. And then the expressing and regulating are what we do with our feelings. So there are rules around how we express our feelings. Think about it. The rules on Wall Street are very, Scott now went from working in the financial district of New York City to working in a Victorian house on an Ivy League campus. Does it feel different?
Totally.
Right, the rules are different. It works. Some ways it's better, in some ways it's like, what am I doing with my life? But truthfully, the rules are just completely different. I've done talks on Wall Street. First I could not dress like this. I have my jeans and it's not going to work in some of these places. And I go in and it's like, hello, Dr. Brackett. Right? And I always hi. Right? Like the testosterone, the masculinity, the Versace. It's like a whole thing. And, we don't do that on the Yale campus. We barely, I always say we have to pay for eye contact. It's just not that way. We just, it's like, it's kind of schleppy. You wave a little bit, how's it going? You want to go have coffee? Let's talk about it. In my meeting at Wall Street, this one executive of a big firm said to me, Mark, here's what the emotional intelligence, it's about charisma. And I said, well, maybe a little bit. He goes, but like what you just talked about, that's not going to happen here. I said, what do you mean? He's like, we're not going to go around the table and tell each other how we feel. The rules are different. And maybe,
So what do you do for Goldman Sachs or for what kind of training do you do?
That's a whole other story. But
obviously different than what you're doing with children.
The truth is, in the end, it's about the mindsets. So I joke about this, but even at a place like Yale, which is sort of progressive, we're still, many of my colleagues, came off the Mayflower. They're lovely people, but, they're just not necessarily thinking that, like a surgeon. I've had surgeons like literally like look at me like an eagle would look at a squirrel and be like, Mark, like I do surgery. And I'm like, okay, right? Think about the incidental thing I was talking about, like you got in a fight with your spouse or you're, you go into the surgery and I don't know. And he, look at the records of doctors and they're like, the wrong leg came off. You hear about that all the time, right? Like, by the way, it was you wonder, like, what was going on? Was he distracted? Was she distracted? Was she frustrated and overwhelmed? So my pushback is that, well, for one of our other colleagues at the center does a tremendous amount of coaching for people who work for these doctors because they're miserable. So yes, you can be a tyrant and be successful. My theory is that you can be rich and successful and the chief executive of a company, but you're going to die really lonely because nobody wants to be around people that are dysregulated, right? And you see it, you just witness it. I don't say it that way in general. I'm telling you that way. So that's the last skill of regulation. And what do I mean by that? Well, it's a complex skill, and it's if you think of a pyramid of emotional intelligence, it's like the top. It's like the ultimate skill is to be able to self-manage emotions, right? Deal with the frustration, the overwhelm, but also to help other people. So when we look at our work on the leaders who are higher in emotional intelligence, one thing their teachers say about them is that they're emotionally supportive. They recognize that they're stressed out and say, let's try this. They offer them ideas. They're communicative. They want to demonstrate that they know how they feel and want to give them ideas for alleviating the stress and for managing it more effectively. So part of this work is it's not just me, selfish me about my self-regulation. It's really about offering the strategies and helping other people to regulate their feelings. It's like good parenting, right? Don't you co-regulate with your kid? You have conversations, you listen, you offer, you get feedback. You try. You try. And this is part of what we talk about in our parenting work, because Ruler is a full parenting a system as well, is that if the adults, and you mentioned this a minute ago, if the adults are not role models for this work, guess what? It's going to be really hard to do this at the classroom level. Because if the teacher, him or herself, doesn't have the language for emotion, if the teacher doesn't have, for him or herself, the strategies to regulate, first they have no credibility teaching it. Right? Like, if I have to tell you to calm down one more time, not the best role modeling. I've seen it all the time. Does that resonate with any of you? As a parent, have you ever said something to your kid like, calm down? There's a great video we have of a teacher in a school. She's like, go to the calm down chair. Right? It's like, maybe you should go to the calm down chair. The kid is only 5 years old. Like, let him have his little tantrum. He's doing fine. You, on the other hand, need to go for therapy. So those are the skills. Any questions about those skills?
So when you roll this out, do you also train the teachers, I take it, as well?
Yes. So Ruler is a trainer of the trainer approach, and I'll do that. I'm going to end with those kind of the implementation so you know what it looks like.
Can you recognize this in somebody, like, for instance, in the hiring process? Like in a half-hour interview? Can you recognize this?
You can. You definitely can look for the cues and the clues. I do that all the time when I'm hiring. Maybe reconsider my skills.
Sometimes successful, sometimes not.
That wasn't about Scott. That was about some of our other people. But yes, you can. So you're looking for, one thing I look for, like in a Yale, when we hire a lot of students, is like how much talk time they need. Like someone who comes in like, and this is what I do, and I'm so fabulous. I'm like, great. I hope you get a great job. Like no listening skills, right? No ability to pause. No ability to, or they're talking and they're out here. It's like, wait a minute, we're in a conversation right now.
And just as I'm taking it back to the boardroom for a second, if you think about the things we talked about in the classroom, you really can argue some of the same things. There's a school district in Connecticut, which shall remain nameless, that was trying to make a decision about a new superintendent, and there was literally a brawl. I mean, there was a fist fight, in the middle of the board meeting. And obviously that doesn't happen every day. But having said that, there is...
It's on tape.
Yeah, it is. It's on tape for everybody to see. You could probably go on
Is it
to...
on YouTube?
On YouTube, exactly. But and that's the extreme example. But there are levels to constructively have like dialogue and disagreement at the board level, because that's healthy, and not everybody's going to always agree, nor should they. But there are ways in which that becomes very destructive, and you almost have to wonder if fifth grade class is looking at a board video from the meeting the night before, would they be, is that modeling good behavior or not? And
100% agree.
Yeah.
A very well-known superintendent in our state who I work with regularly left her position as the superintendent of one of the largest districts in Connecticut because of one school board member who was just a saboteur. This person just was a saboteur, and it just was heartbreaking. And she wrote a letter to the Commissioner of Education of the state about why she left her position. And it was all about the emotion dysregulation of that board member. It just was. And
We have our public place, we have our not public.
Yes. So we only have a few minutes, and I want to wrap up just showing all of you kind of our general model. This is more theory, but it also demonstrates what we work with. So, one of the things, what's your name, sir? No, this guy, you. Roger? Right, so Roger, when you've done other professional development in your building, and just be honest with me if you can. If you can't, then you could just say I can't. Like, you've brought a new literacy program. Do you make sure you go to the training, or do you trust, you kind of know that your literacy people will get the training?
Probably both.
Okay.
Sometimes it depends.
Sometimes yeah, right. As a superintendent, deputy superintendent, that's your role, right? Do you feel like you need to be present at the writing workshop? Or do you feel like you can have your instructional lead work with the teachers to do the instructional piece?
I think if I go, it's more about collaboration. It's not about distrust.
Uh-huh. But how critical is it for you to be there?
Depends. Depends on what it is.
Yeah, exactly. What we argue is that it's super critical for emotional intelligence, right? Because it's a system approach. You don't have to be the best writer to have a great teacher who teaches great writing, right? You need to hire great teachers who can teach writing, and you can have other skills. But when it comes to emotional intelligence, everybody has to have the skill. It's like everybody's got to be able to speak properly. Everybody's got to be the role model for emotional intelligence. That's just the way we've learned that over the years. I can't tell you, I can go into endless examples of like superintendents like, I'm so glad Marc is here with his team because you all really need this. I'm just like, the training should be like, let's all break for lunch because this is going to not go well, and just terrible role modeling. Or the principal who says, I want everyone to focus. You got to focus. And then the person sits in the front row and is on their phone the whole time during the training. It's like, wait a minute, you just told everybody to focus, and now you're like not even paying attention. So we have to model it as the adults. So that's why it's leaders and educators and staff, it's classrooms, it's infusion into the mission and policies. This doesn't happen tomorrow. But if you have teachers who are trained in emotional intelligence, but your behavior support systems are like no nonsense, right? Kid speaks out, says something nasty, automatic suspension. How does that align with teaching emotional intelligence? Right? So you've got to start thinking about how do you make sure these principles are being infused into the way you operate. Leadership, teaching, policies, mission, vision. Obviously family education. Now we even have a whole outside of school time people. So there are tools that I won't go into any detail on today. We call them the anchors of emotional intelligence, and people who've come to our training understand them. The primary focus is that we want people to be able to be comfortable saying how they want to feel. So instead of having a lot of rules, we say, how do you want to feel? These are examples of what we call the emotional intelligence charters. So these students want to feel spirited and united and respected and determined and empowered. The mood meter is our tool for building self-awareness, for building that emotional awareness, that granularity. It's a tool based in decades of science, and it helps us to kind of take our inner lives and project it into emotion space. We even have an advanced, what we call the feeling words training, which we teach teachers how to bring emotion concepts directly into the content through personal storytelling, through linking it to the character, whether it be a history content around the Holocaust or nonviolent resistance or their Boston Tea Party, to having them go home and teach their families the word. Hey mom, hey dad, hey au pair. I just learned a new word. The word is alienated. It means to feel left out and isolated. I'm kind of feeling that right now. And then obviously how to regulate those emotions. And there are other tools, just to show you what it looks like in the lower grades. Kids make these tools, they give them as gifts to their parents, so that way they all learn about it. There is beautiful art examples of this work that the specialists get involved and do creations around the school. This is a high school that did an amazing job. They had Mood Meter Day and did games and activities for the kids. And then we even have an app that we built that now schools get for free to plot themselves and the people around in the school. You can do group mood meters. You can have the entire faculty of 500 project how they feel. There's other tools, one we call the meta moment. That's for dealing with very difficult emotions. And then there's a tool we call the blueprint, which has to do with perspective taking, empathy, problem solving, conflict resolution. So lastly, just to show you kind of where schools are at in different phases, the readiness planning phase is, you're kind of all out of that at this point because most of you have done some training. The staff and professional learning is all about the adults. It's the school leaders, the educators, and non-teaching staff that we train. So those tools that I share with you, they all learn them. Everyone gets to understand their feelings better. Everyone starts realizing that I have to model good emotion regulation strategies. And then at the second year of implementation in general, but it depends on how fast schools do the work, then we get into all the classroom level work and the family engagement work. Because we want to basically, with families, as kids are learning it, then they teach their families, and then the schools can do workshops, which we also provide, to then reinforce it, and then it grows kind of as a family and as a classroom. And then finally, what we call sustainability and innovation, which means that I've been lucky to have done this work for many years, and we have schools that have been doing this for 7, 10, 12 years. And what happens over time, it just becomes morphed into the school environment. Like I was just at a high school yesterday, and I had a school from Australia who was here. The head of the principal of the school was visiting the school in New York City, and they just had this amazing now they're going to work with each other internationally, so that the high schools are going to collaborate so that the Australian kids can learn about the New York City kids. And the Australian people have been working with me for 10 years. They're like one of our best schools. They've designed this incredible sequencing for ruler at the high school level. This high school is just starting out, so now they're learning from that high school. They're sharing the content because they've been innovating for so long and like making it really built into the system. And now they want to just disseminate and share their best practices that have worked. So that's what happens typically by year 3, that schools are starting to really collaborate. And one of the great things I think about working with Renee and Joan is that we can, like we have 50 schools, like across how many districts? 20, 30? Yeah, who can really work together and innovate. I mean, my hope is that these cohorts will remain together forever, right? That they're constantly working through, you know, the difficulties with implementation, the challenges. Like today we had a principal in the back who said, Mark, I've got like 150 people, and like we only have an auditorium. Like we don't have like this kind of seating. Can you share with me like what do people do, like to like do this kind of training when it's like seating? And I just said, well, I have ideas, but like, does anyone else have that kind of problem in school? And this other principal, we've got that. I said, well, what would you? Da, 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 da. And so it's like this idea of kind of just sharing and getting people to really work together. Let me stop there because I know we're out of time. Any questions? Yes.
I understand why you start with the middle school. Why then do you go to the elementary rather than the high school?
No, we don't start in the middle school. You guys start in the middle school.
Okay.
We start wherever.
Started in the middle school. And obviously you must have told him something different.
It just might have been readiness factor, right? So, you know, sometimes what happens is that sometimes you have a new principal, and I'm just making this up, but like they just started, and they're overwhelmed with just like getting to know the faculty. They don't want to be known as the principal that comes in with a new thing. So they want to wait a year. So we're not going to, you can't push people to do this work.
So you don't advocate one grade or one age or another?
No.
It's preschool till tomb. Seriously. I mean that.
And our schools, of the 50 schools,
the districts, the 25 or so districts, they've all started differently. We have some that started with the high school, some that started with the elementary, some that went all in, all schools at once. So it varies, so there isn't an exact formula.
Yeah, you can't, I mean, in the ideal scenario, you do the district-wide approach, like the whole district at once, so that way everyone's on board. School board, superintendent, district-level administrators, principals, teachers, students, and families. That's like ideal, but it doesn't, I'll give you the example. In New York City, we started with 1 school, it went to 5 schools, now we have 280 schools, soon we'll be in 1,500 schools. Seattle Public Schools, we started in 1 school, it was a friend of mine who became a principal of a school back 10 years ago. She did great work, she spread it to another school, then we went to 20 schools, now we're in all 60 schools. There's no...
And we in Pleasant Valley had a unique situation with retirement. We had only one of our 6 building administrators was tenured, and her by only 1 year. So all 3 buildings, brand new, energetic, ready to make their mark, taking over from existing people. The field was fertile.
And they were ready. So there you go.
So go with all 3. If it had been 2 years ago, we probably would have ignored the middle school for a while.
Right.
Because that principal may not have been somebody we wanted to move into.
Right. Makes sense. Other questions before we wrap up? And I know that we have to get home because yes.
And at the beginning of the conversation, you threw out some statistics.
Correct.
And noted that the over-focus maybe on academics to the detriment of other things. In some ways, because if we look back 50 years, I don't think we were quite feeling like this in schools.
Yeah.
And it seems like, in a way, we're a little disingenuous because we are creating the problem that's causing us to need this. And so
I couldn't agree more.
We're going in and we're saying, yeah, this sucks, but we're going to teach you how to deal with it.
Well, that's why I think
Because
the prevention
way,
is better than the intervention, right? So
kindergartners are not playing in kitchen centers or dressing up. We're trying to sit them down and do things to kids that if we start there, then I can see why they're anxious all the way through.
Yep.
And I feel more kids are coming to BOCES who wouldn't have come in the past because they can't handle it.
Yep. Well, I think what you're getting at, though, is exactly what we're trying to tackle, which is move away from the intervention model, which is, yes, we have a nation that is stressed out, and we're now, for example, everyone is doing mindfulness work. I'm a proponent of mindfulness. I love to breathe, right? And I like to be present, and I like to meditate. I love all that kind of stuff. But the mindset around it is that it's to decrease the stress. But it's not saying, let's look at the problem. Right? So, like, really, exactly.
What's the root cause of everything you're talking about today?
Well, so obviously we didn't get into everything today, but when you design a school and you teach and lead through the lens of what we call an emotion scientist, you're taking all those things into consideration. Right? You're really thinking about, is the seating aligned with teaching emotional intelligence? I've been in classrooms where like there's like 40 kids. I'm in the 8th row, and I'm looking at someone's neck for the whole day. Like I'm thinking, can't hear the teacher, and I'm looking at a neck. How is that engaging? How am I learning how to read people's emotions? I mean, think about it. So like it gives people the kind of the way of thinking, the curiosity, right? You're asking those questions as opposed to just saying, okay. Like the best example I have for that, and we'll wrap up after this one unless there's more questions, is I gave a talk at a psychiatric association conference, and one of the leaders of this field came up to me and he's like, great talk, blah, 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 but like, Mark, here's the deal. We figured out in our modeling that America needs 8,000 more child psychiatrists to deal with all this stress and anxiety. And I looked at him and I said, I don't think you listened to me. Like, my job is to put you out of business. Right? Like, if that's the mindset of our world, that we're going to train more psychiatrists because the world's chaos is worsening, maybe we need to shift what it means to educate a child. Like, let's give them some space. Like, right? Think about it. So that's the goal of this work. Obviously, we can't do everything in one training in 2 days, but it's really getting people to think about the role of emotions and emotion skills in leading, teaching, learning, decision-making, relationships, etc., and slowly make those shifts.
So you've had this in some schools for 10 years?
Yes.
Is there any way that you have to gauge change?
Oh yeah, we have tons of evaluation data. So look at that. You asked the question, I push the slide, and it's there. So we've done experiments in New York City. Actually, this is one of my very first studies was in Long Island at an elementary in Valley Stream, where we did an experiment where we looked at the implementation. We found great differences in English language arts and behavior, school problems, adaptive skills. In New York City, we found differences, around 50% differences in our tough schools for referrals for suspension. We found that fidelity really matters, that schools that do this work well have kids with more skills, better complex skills, greater social competence. We found that schools that do this work have less bullying and healthier emotional climates. We found that schools that do this work not only have more engaging classrooms and supportive classrooms, but teachers who get higher ratings in being effective. Think about it. When you do it, if your teacher is better self-managed, if the classroom is more engaging, you can spend a lot more time on task. When people don't have time to do this, I'm like, how much time does it take you to corral the kids to get them to focus? I can spend 15 minutes to get them. Well, what if you had skills and strategies that it took a minute? You'd have 14 more minutes to engage in good instruction. So lots of research. I'll end by just sharing with you something that's provocative. So we are working in the state of Connecticut to do a statewide initiative. We have funders and we've got legislators. So we have the Association in Connecticut of Superintendents. We got the School Board Association. Actually, they've just approved us doing a survey for all school boards about the role and importance of this. I'd love to talk with you about that. We have the Association of Secondary Schools. We've got like the RESCs, which are the BOCES of Connecticut. We've got the Superintendent Association. We have fellows. We have legislators. And we have the Commission of Education, all working on a task force to really make this a permanent part of education. I'm sorry? Yeah, we have the
association.
Yeah. Yep. Actually, Scott and I are doing a presentation at, it's called CABE, in a couple weeks.
We have to send you to Washington.
I'm ready to go. We've been. So anyway, lovely to meet all of you.